Hello, my name is Christian Chun, and the title of my talk is Talk is Cheap, Ersatz Economics and Corporate Speak. So McCloskey coined the term ersatz economics, in which she defined as, quote, the untutored economic experience, end of quote, which is, quote, a bad teacher of economics, just as the unaided eye is a bad teacher of astronomy. Practically everything that you thought you knew about economics before studying it is wrong, end of quote. By drawing the analogy with how we see gaseous spheres in distant galaxies with how we directly live, think, and feel the economics of the everyday, be it collection bills, overdue notices, minimum wages here in the US, rent increases, and now with the pandemic, more eviction notices due to the service worker job losses, McCloskey dismisses people's experiential firsthand knowledge of it. Many might not know academic economic theories, but they certainly feel the effects of capitalism through its practices at the workplace and beyond. Are the discourses and, quote from her, the vocabulary of such ersatz economics, the economics of the man in the street, end of quote, much different than the discourses of capitalism in what has been called corporate speak, as mediated by mainstream economists? So I first briefly outlined the three main theories in economics, neoclassical, Keynesian, and Marxian, in how each differently defines and frames circulations of capital. What exactly constitutes scientific economic discourse? Is corporate speak based on specific economic theory claiming to be a science, and does it differ from ersatz economic theory and discourses? So in the academic disciplinary field of economics, there exists three major sets of theories: neoclassical, Keynesian, and Marxian. Neoclassical theory has insisted on the notion of supply and demand of the so-called free market, in which they frame the economy as the collection of businesses who succeed and fail based on their own merits of being able to meet the demands of consumers. If there isn't enough of a demand, it's the business's fault for not producing what people want. However, if they produce too much of a product, they'll lose out. So basically, neoclassical economists will say it's your own damn fault for not succeeding because you're a loser. In keeping with this, they also insist on fewer taxes on the rich, so the rich are free to succeed, to build their businesses and create wealth that will trickle down to the rest of us. Thus, neoliberalism is not a new thing, but been building on the neoclassical economic stance. In contrast, the Keynesian theory emerged from the British economist John Maynard Keynes, who during the depths of the Great Depression worked to save the capitalist system by formulating the state-managed version of it by increasing consumer demand to support businesses with government-run ones funded by increased tax money to build infrastructure, schools, and so on. This led to the emergence of the social welfare state in many countries, including here in the US. And in fact, during the 1950s, with the Eisenhower administration, the income of the 1%, the elite, were taxed at 91%. And that is how the interstate highway system in the US was built, with that money from these taxes. President Eisenhower, who was a Republican, would have been called a commie by both Republicans and Democrats today. So when theorists of these frameworks employ the same words such as commodity, wage, price, profit, value, and capitalism in their theoretical discussions and empirical findings, quote, they define such objects differently, and because of this, they literally mean different things by those words, end of quote. This is by Wolf and Resnick, 2012. So how then is one able to objectively understand these competing neoclassical and Keynesian theories whilst also impartially reasoning their theoretical validities if these core terms are used differently, leading to much different conceptualizations and hence understandings of the co-constructed interanimations of social and economic relations? The stance of objectivity vis-a-vis certain parameters of selected knowledge in contrast to framings of subjective or biased forms of knowledge is of course inherently ideological. Inasmuch as living utterances, quote, cannot fail to brush up against thousands of living dialogic threads woven by social ideological consciousness around the given object of an utterance, it cannot fail to become an active participant in social dialogue. End of quote, by Bakhtin, 1981. The denial of the dialogical is evident in neoclassical economic theory in that it presents itself as monological, quote, in which the unifying force in discourse becomes intolerant or at least dominant, giving rise to a totalitizing point of view, end of quote, by Le Capra, 1983. This is evident in the word capitalism, which is articulated and mediated differently in neoclassical, Keynesian, and Marxian theories. While some theoretical strands of Marxian frameworks question if capitalism has, quote, any essential or coherent identity, end of quote, by Gibson Graham, 1996, neoclassical economists insist on their authoritative word of capitalism as being the ideal rationalized system of enabling individual freedom, liberty, and our innate human nature in dismissing any negative characteristics. As such, there is no objectivity with neoclassical economics. Rather, it seeks an authority through their discourses demanding that, quote, we acknowledge it, that we make it our own, it binds us, quite independent of any power it might have to persuade us internally. We encounter it with its authority already fused to it. End of quote. That is by Bakhtin, 1981. One discourse prevalent in Marxian economics as being a definitive feature of capitalism is the term exploitation, which would never be accepted by neoclassical economists. So briefly, exploitation as defined by Marx was that the working day is separated into what he called the necessary labor time and then the surplus labor time. So for the proverbial 8-hour workday, the first couple of hours that we're working, that would be the necessary labor time in which what we produce is then paid back to us in our wages. However, after that, after those 3 or 4 hours, what he called the surplus labor time is basically we're working for free because everything that we're producing in those next 4 hours, we're not getting paid for. And that is what the surplus labor value produced, which is called profit, appropriated by the capitalists. And that is how we get exploited. So certainly amongst academic and professional economists, what has been called by Gramsci the traditional intellectuals, the authoritative discourse of capitalism is, quote, given its sounds in lofty spheres, not those of familiar contact, end of quote, by Bakhtin, 1981. So one illustration of this dynamic of a traditional intellectual insisting on a monologic authoritative discourse, contesting as well as perpetuating specific hegemonic meanings that various people associate with the word socialism was in the February 24th, 2020 broadcast on the non-commercial public-funded US news program Democracy Now!, hosted by Amy Goodman. The online radio show featured a debate between the Nobel laureate economist Paul Krugman and the self-identified socialist economist Richard Wolff on the US presidential candidate, Senator Bernie Sanders, and what socialism means. When Krugman was asked a question posed by Goodman why his recent column was headlined, "Bernie Sanders isn't a socialist," he replied thusly, I'm quoting from what Krugman says, okay, I mean, Bernie says he loves Denmark. I love Denmark. I think Denmark is an illustration of how decent a society can be. The Danes don't think they're socialists. They think they're social democrats. They don't use the word socialist, and it isn't socialism as we've always used to understand it. It's not government ownership of the means of production. It's not seizing the commanding heights of the economy. It's a really strong social safety net and a strong labor movement, all of which I support. In Arguing with Zombies, I have a whole chapter called Eek, Socialism, which is about the Republican habit of playing three-card Monte. You say that you're for universal health care, they say, that's socialist. You say you're for universal child care, they say, think about how many people Stalin killed. You know, it's this crazy stuff. So why use the word? Why describe yourself? I think it's kind of self-indulgent to call yourself a socialist and give the Republicans unnecessary ammunition. I think probably we're for the same. I'm for the same kinds of policies. I'm for universal health care, universal child care, all of these things. Why buy into the Republican effort to make this sound like something Stalin would do? End of quote. In case of Krugman's argument, it's clear that, as Sargent writes, expertise is of relative importance if it contradicts the experiences people have in their own everyday lives, end of quote. Krugman's ostensible fear of using the word socialism plays right into the hegemonic perpetuation of the definition used by not only conservatives, but also liberals, mainstream media, and school curriculum for decades. His social framework of the word appears to be, quote, a guided doing in his, quote, continuous corrective control, end of quote, by Goffman, 1974, in denying the resemiotizing recontextualizations of socialism that have contested Stalinist versions. Throughout the rest of the interview, Krugman does not offer any alternative word to define the policies he associates with socialism. For example, a really strong safety social net and strong labor movement, universal healthcare, and thus legitimizes the capitalist system by implying these policies are inherently compatible with capitalism. Instead, he frames the usages of the word being self-indulgent, and in doing so, continues the social circulation of the authoritative and ideological discursive collocations of socialism with Stalin and its sinister implications. When asked to respond to Krugman's framing of socialism, Richard Wolff answered, quote, there is no agency, neither private nor public nor private, that defines what a socialist is. If you follow the socialist movement for the last 150 years, you would discover it has been a contested terrain from day one. There were different interpretations and different meanings. Bernie Sanders is perfectly in line with one of the traditions of what socialism is. It's the government having a big role in offsetting some of the awful qualities of capitalism. But we also know that this kind of control that the government tries to operate is very difficult for it to succeed with. We once had a New Deal in this country. We lost most of it because we didn't go beyond a government intervention to change the society. What Bernie Sanders represents is an awareness that it's time to have a conversation we should have had for 75 years about our capitalist system and whether we can do better. This is now a changed environment in which what was taboo in this country isn't anymore. And Bernie has already achieved that breaking of a taboo in this country to talk about socialism, its strengths and weaknesses, its different interpretations, and compare them to capitalism rather than running away because nasty conservatives call us various names. That's not a profound reason. And for the young people of this country, it doesn't carry much weight anyway. So I welcome the opening that Bernie achieves, that we can talk about socialism, its different interpretations, and why we ought to explore them a lot more than we've been able to under the taboo of the last 75 years, end of quote. So in contrast to Krugman's insistence on adhering to the right-wing discourse of socialism, Wolff presents an alternative framing in which he notes not only the contested terrain of the different interpretations and meanings of socialism, but also the diachronic trajectories of the word, particularly now that the Cold War has ended 30 years ago. Socialism no longer has the same meaning to those born after the collapse of the Soviet Union did, and does to many born right after the end of World War II. To a certain extent, the right has not been entirely incorrect in its assessment of socialism as it was practiced by the Soviet Union. In the ensuing years of the Stalin's regime, the word socialism, quote, became inseparable from the idea of state activity, control, ownership, planning, capital accumulation, social mobilization. Statism subjugated the working class to a new ruling bureaucratic stratum that perpetuates its hegemony under the banner of Marxism or Marxism-Leninism, end of quote, by Boggs, 1984. Thus, in any conversation with those on the right, it's important to acknowledge what Stuart Hall wrote, that the deeply undemocratic character of administered socialism, end of quote. So in sharing with some of the same ground with the right on this issue, is it possible to further dialogue on economic systems? Although the Soviet government called itself socialist and communist, as Wolff and his fellow Marxist economist colleague, Stephen Resnick, argued in their 2002 book, Class Theory and History, Capitalism and Communism in the USSR, the Soviet apparatchiks merely replaced the capitalist class in their deciding who would get what from the workers' production of surplus labor value. So capitalism has a multiplicity of meanings, which of course are shaped and articulated through ideological frames, some of which have achieved common sense hegemony. One such example is that capitalism is freedom. That is the freedom to sell one's labor to any employer, whether to set up your own business, either by having capital of your own or borrowing it from a lender, such as a bank or individual investors. This idea of freedom extends to also leaving any job in a capitalist society, unlike in the feudal and enslavement era, in which serfs and enslaved people were bound to their employer throughout their entire lives. Viewed in this frame, capitalism does appear to offer freedom to the individual who can exercise choice in the availability and opportunity of multiple jobs, offerings, and possibilities. And yet this freedom also extends to the employer, who has the liberty, as it were, to fire or let go of any employee at a moment's notice, and often without any legal ramification in doing so. The decision is usually made by only the employer, without the consent or input by the workforce, by the entire workforce. This would appear to contradict the notion of freedom for the employees in a company in which a situation like this depends on the will and at times whim of a singular entity, be it a boss or a board of shareholders. Indeed, as Frederick Engels noted, that the worker, quote, is in law and in fact the slave of the bourgeoisie, which can decree his life or death. It offers him the means of living, but only for the equivalent for his work. And in doing, end of quote, and in doing so, the capitalist, quote, even lets him have the appearance of acting from a free choice, of making the contract with free, unconstrained consent as a responsible agent who has attained his majority, end of quote. So the differing and often competing misunderstandings of what capitalism is, depending on who is involved in the making and mediating of meanings, stem in part by, quote, whose word it is and for whom it is meant, end of quote. This interactional dynamic of how one defines capitalism and who has taken up the definition is, quote, the very same thing that makes ideological signs vital and mutable, is also, however, that which makes it a refracting and distorting medium, end of quote, by Voloshinov. So as a Gramscian traditional intellectual who sells my labor production of teaching and writing, I've been engaged with how, as Voloshinov wrote, differently oriented accents that intersect in every ideological sign. Okay, so I offer an alternative framing of capitalism that departs from the hegemonic ones of freedom and the right to choose. From my own perspective, based on my realities and observations of others, capitalism is a fundamentally dictatorial system in which the mutually interanimating economic and social relations between the surplus value producing laborers and the surplus value appropriating employers enact anti-democratic practices, in that the latter are the sole decision makers in determining and deciding how much the former gets paid, the amount of holiday, vacation, and time off from the work they receive, and benefits, if any. These systemic relations of capitalism are by their very design inherently exploitative of those of us who are producing the surplus value. We might complain and appeal and protest, but and go on strike, but in the end, we often cannot override the final decision made by the employers on this matter. What one often hears is that if you don't like your job or your boss, get another job somewhere else. However, since quote, the worker has become a commodity and he is lucky if he can find a buyer, end of quote, by Marx. As many of us know, finding another job is never easy. So thus, quote, the worker has not only to struggle for his physical means of subsistence, he must also struggle for work, end of quote, also by Marx. Okay, so if we are, quote unquote, fortunate enough to get another job, perhaps the new boss might be nicer and gentler, but in the end, they're still the only ones calling the shots. These economic and social relations affect one another so that our social identities become an integral component in reproducing the system. Thus, capitalism in a nutshell. You, the working person, bakes the pie. Then your employer, landlord, mortgage and loan lenders, insurance carriers, government tax agencies, credit card companies, and banks all demand and take their slice of the pie you baked. You're left with the crumbs called wages. Yes, the capitalist provided you with the ingredients and the tools, the means of production, in order to bake the pie. But since you did all the labor in making it, shouldn't you at least have a say in how the profits would be shared from the selling of the pie? Instead, when we get our wages that do not reflect the surplus exchange value, the profits of the commodities we produce, we feel the need to be grateful to have a job and a salary. Thank you, master, indeed.